Let's start with something most avoidants will never say out loud. They didn't just lose a partner, they lost their emotional regulator. See, on the surface, avoidants pride themselves on self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone. I handle my own problems. I'm better on my own. That's the identity. That's the armor. But underneath that identity is a nervous system that still responds to closeness, safety, tone of voice, and emotional consistency. I'm just like anyone else's. And this is where the empath comes in. The empath wasn't just loving them, the empath was stabilizing them. Every time the avoidant pulled away, the empath responded with patience. Every time they went silent, the empath tried to understand rather than attack. When the avoidant felt overwhelmed, stressed, or emotionally flooded, the empath softened the atmosphere. Their presence lowered the temperature in the room. Their reassurance regulated anxiety. Their emotional availability created a subtle but powerful sense of safety. Here's the psychological truth. Human beings co-regulate. Our nervous systems sync. Heart rates align. Stress levels drop in the presence of someone calm and attuned. The avoidant may not consciously register this, but their body does. So when they reject the empath, it often feels empowering at first. Distance equals control. Control equals safety. They think they've removed pressure, but what they've actually removed is the stabilizer. And that's when something strange begins to happen. At first there's relief, space, silence, no emotional demands. But then the silence gets louder. The stress at work feels heavier. The nights feel longer. The little irritations don't dissolve as easily. They may find themselves more restless, more distracted, more irritable, and they don't immediately connect it to the loss. Because what they're experiencing isn't just heartbreak, it's dysregulation. For months, maybe years, someone was helping their nervous system feel safe. Not by force, not by control, but by presence. And once that presence is gone, the avoidant has to sit alone with their own unprocessed emotions. The anxiety they thought they didn't have. The loneliness they thought didn't affect them. The vulnerability they believed they could outrun. This is the part nobody talks about. Avoidants often confuse independence with emotional isolation. True independence means you can connect without losing yourself, but emotional isolation is just self-protection disguised as strength. And when the empath leaves, the illusion of isolation as strength starts to crack. Now they have to regulate themselves. Now they have to soothe their own fears. Now they have to confront the feelings they once muted through distance. And that's when missing begins, not always consciously, not always dramatically, but physiologically. They may not say, I miss how she calmed me. Instead, it shows up as checking old messages, thinking about conversations, comparing new partners to the depth they once had, because the body remembers safety. The empath created an environment where vulnerability was possible without shame, where emotions were welcomed, not judged. That kind of space is rare, and you don't realize how rare it is until it's gone. So when an avoidant misses the empath, they're not just missing affection, they're missing the regulation, the grounding, the invisible emotional scaffolding that made life feel steadier than they understood at the time. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. We often recognize value only in absence. Presence feels normal. Loss feels instructive. The empath didn't just love them. They steadied them. And when that steadiness disappears, the avoidant is left with a question they can't easily escape. Was I really independent, or was someone quietly holding me together? Because sometimes what we reject isn't weakness. It's the very thing that made us strong. Now let's go deeper, because this is where the real conflict begins. The battle between the ego and the nervous system. When the avoidant walked away, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like power. It felt like control restored. See, for someone with avoidant attachment patterns, intimacy can unconsciously register as threat. Not because love is dangerous, but because closeness activates vulnerability. And vulnerability activates old wounds. So when things start to feel intense, the ego steps in with a simple narrative. I'm better off alone. This isn't right. I don't need this. And the moment they pull away, there's relief. That relief is real. It's chemical. The pressure drops. The expectation fades. The emotional demands disappear. Their mind interprets that relief as confirmation. I made the right choice. But here's what most people don't understand. Relief is not the same as peace. Relief is the absence of pressure. Peace is the presence of safety. At first, the ego is loud. It reinforces the story. It protects identity. They were too much. It wouldn't have worked. I'll find something better. The ego's job is to preserve self-image, and for the avoidant, that self-image is independence, strength, emotional self-sufficiency. But while the ego is talking, the nervous system is whispering something else, because attachment doesn't disappear just because you made a decision. Bonding is biological. When you connect deeply with someone, especially an empath who created emotional safety, your brain wires around that connection. Oxytocin, dopamine, emotional memory. The body forms associations between that person and calm, validation, grounding, and the body keeps score. Weeks pass, maybe months. The ego continues to say, I'm fine. But subtle cracks begin to form. They find themselves checking the empath's social media, wondering who they're talking to, comparing every new interaction to the depth they once had. Small moments of restlessness appear, late at night in quiet rooms during stressful days. They may not label it regret, but their behavior reveals longing. This is the internal split. Cognitively, they justify the decision. Physiologically, they feel the absence. And when those two realities don't align, discomfort grows. The ego hates being wrong, so instead of admitting loss, it often doubles down. The avoidant might distract themselves, new relationships, work, achievements, attention from others, and for a while novelty works. Dopamine spikes, validation feels good, but novelty fades, and when it does, what's left is comparison. The empath wasn't just someone who gave attention. They offered emotional depth. They understood nuance. They tolerated silence without withdrawing love. That kind of attunement is rare. And when new partners don't provide the same level of emotional resonance, something feels thinner. Surface level connection cannot satisfy a bond that once had depth. And this is when the ego starts losing the argument. Because the nervous system doesn't care about pride, it cares about safety and connection. It remembers the tone of voice that calmed it, the presence that regulated it, the conversations that made vulnerability feel less terrifying. The avoidant may still say out loud, I'm good. But internally, the question starts forming, did I walk away from something real? Here's the philosophical layer to this. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We construct stories to protect identity, but growth begins the moment we question those stories. For the avoidant, missing the empath isn't immediate, it's delayed. It creeps in through contrast, through silence, through the realization that independence without intimacy feels empty. The ego chose freedom from discomfort, the nervous system wanted connection, and when those two forces collide, truth eventually surfaces. Because you can silence emotions for a season, but you cannot outrun attachment biology forever. At some point, pride gets quiet, and what remains is the undeniable awareness that walking away felt powerful in the moment, but staying might have required courage, and courage, not control, is what real strength looks like. Now let's talk about something even deeper, something that often hits the avoidant long after the breakup is over. The empath didn't just love them, the empath saw them, and being seen is one of the rarest psychological experiences a human being can have. Most people in life interact with the surface version of us, and the personality, the achievements, the humor, the defense mechanisms. But empaths don't stop at the surface. They pay attention to micro-expressions, subtle tone shifts, the silence between words. They sense when something is off, even when nothing is being said. And here's what's powerful about that. Avoidants are masters of emotional concealment. They learned early that vulnerability feels unsafe, so they adapted. They became self-contained, controlled, hard to read, hard to reach, but the empath reached them anyway. Not by force, not by pressure, but by attunement. The empath could sit in the quiet without panicking. They didn't demand constant reassurance. They didn't interpret every withdrawal as rejection. Instead, they leaned in with curiosity. They saw the guardedness and didn't shame it. They saw the distance and didn't attack it. They recognized that behind the detachment was fear, not indifference. And that recognition is transformative, because when someone sees the parts of you that you hide and stays, something inside you softens. For the avoidant, this may have been one of the few relationships where they felt understood without having to fully explain themselves. The empath could read the emotional subtext. They could tell when stress was masking as coldness. They could distinguish between I need space and I'm overwhelmed. That level of emotional intelligence is uncommon. And here's the irony. While the relationship is happening, the avoidant often underestimates its value. Familiarity makes depth feel ordinary. The empath's patience feels expected. Their understanding feels normal. It's only after they enter new connections that the contrast begins. They meet people who respond to withdrawal with withdrawal, who misinterpret silence as lack of interest, who require constant emotional performance, and suddenly, what once felt ordinary now feels rare. They start to realize something uncomfortable. Not everyone sees beneath the armor. Not everyone has the capacity to love both the strength and the fragility at the same time. The empath did, and this realization can be destabilizing. because being seen is vulnerable. It's exposing, but it's also deeply regulating. When someone understands you at a level you barely understand yourself, it reduces the effort required to perform. You don't have to constantly manage perception. You don't have to explain every mood shift. You don't have to defend your complexity. You can just exist. That's a powerful psychological gift. When the avoidant rejected the empath, they may have told themselves, I'll find someone else. And they probably will. But finding attention is easy. Finding attraction is common. Finding someone who can emotionally decode you without making you feel defective, that's rare. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. To be seen is to be validated at the level of identity. When someone truly sees you and accepts you, they affirm your humanity. They make your inner world feel legitimate. That kind of affirmation doesn't just boost ego, it nourishes the psyche. So when the avoidant begins to miss the empath, it's not always about missing affection. It's about missing understanding. It's about missing the one person who looked past the walls and didn't try to tear them down, just gently waited at the door. And when that person is gone, something becomes clear. You can find many people who admire you. You can find many people who desire you. But the person who truly sees you and stays, that is rare, and rare is not easily replaced. Now here's where the illusion really starts to unravel. After the empath is gone, many avoidants don't sit in grief for long. They move, they act, they re-engage with the world, and on the surface, it can look like they've upgraded, like they've replaced what they lost. New conversations, new attention, new chemistry. It almost seems effortless, but there's something important happening underneath that most people don't recognize. Validation is not the same thing as intimacy. Validation feels good. It boosts ego. It reassures identity. When someone new is attracted to you, interested in you, intrigued by you, your brain releases dopamine. There's novelty. There's excitement. There's a sense of expansion. And for the avoidant, this stage is comfortable. Early connection doesn't demand depth. It doesn't require full vulnerability. It's light, it's stimulating, it's controlled. But intimacy is different. Intimacy requires exposure. It requires staying present when things are no longer new and impressive. It requires being known beyond the curated version of yourself. And that's where the empath relationship was fundamentally different. The empath didn't just validate the avoidant, they understood them. They weren't impressed by the image. They were connected to the essence. They weren't just reacting to charm or competence. They were responding to the internal world behind it. And that level of connection can't be replicated through novelty. So what happens? At first, the avoidant feels fine, maybe even better. Less pressure, less intensity, more admiration. But over time, the stimulation plateaus. The excitement normalizes. And when it does, comparison quietly enters the room. Conversations feel lighter, but thinner. Attention feels flattering, but not grounding. Attraction feels exciting, but not stabilizing. And here's the psychological mechanism at play. Dopamine fades with familiarity. But oxytocin, the bonding hormone tied to safety and trust, builds over time through emotional depth, consistency, and vulnerability. The empath relationship had oxytocin. The rebound connection often runs on dopamine, and dopamine alone cannot sustain a sense of emotional home. This is where the avoidant begins to sense something missing. They may not articulate it clearly, they may not even consciously admit it, but there's a subtle dissatisfaction, a quiet awareness that being desired is not the same as being deeply known. Surface-level admiration feeds ego. Deep emotional intimacy feeds the nervous system. And the nervous system always wins in the long run. You can distract yourself with new faces, new dates, new attention, but when stress hits, when life becomes overwhelming, when silence stretches into late-night reflection, what you crave is not admiration. You crave safety. You crave the person who understood your silence without demanding performance. You crave the depth that allowed you to exhale. And this is when the realization can become uncomfortable. The empath wasn't just someone who loved intensely. They loved intelligently. They knew how to navigate emotional complexity. They tolerated inconsistency without escalating. They created stability without control. That kind of dynamic doesn't just feel good, it feels rare. And rare becomes visible only in contrast. The avoidant may still move forward. They may still appear detached. But internally there's a shift. They start recognizing that attention is abundant, but attunement is not. That attraction is common, but alignment is not. And once you've experienced alignment, surface-level connection feels incomplete. Here's the philosophical layer. Human beings don't just seek pleasure. We seek meaning. And meaning comes from depth, from being understood, from shared emotional reality, from mutual growth. Validation entertains, intimacy transforms. And when the novelty fades and the comparison settles in, the avoidant is left with a quiet truth they can't easily ignore. Being wanted is easy. Being known is rare. And confusing the two is how you lose something irreplaceable. And here's where everything shifts. Because sometimes growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from loss. When the empath finally detaches, when they stop reaching out, stop explaining, stop trying to hold the emotional bridge together, that's when the avoidant experiences something unfamiliar. Finality. As long as the empath was still there, like still hoping, still responding, still available, the avoidant had psychological leverage. Even in distance, there was reassurance. If I change my mind, they're there. That silent safety net keeps accountability low. It allows avoidance to continue without real consequence. But the moment the empath truly lets go, something destabilizes. Because now the door is not just closed, so it's unavailable. And that's when the nervous system registers real loss. See, avoidants are often comfortable with controlled distance. What they struggle with is irreversible absence. When the empath no longer pursues, no longer waits, no longer softens the space, the avoidant is left alone with themselves, without the emotional buffer we talked about earlier, and pain becomes the teacher. Not dramatic pain, not always visible pain, but a slow, reflective discomfort, a replaying of conversations, a reconsideration of moments where vulnerability was offered and deflected, a recognition that someone chose them fully, and they responded with hesitation. This is where regret starts forming, not because they suddenly become sentimental, but because clarity emerges in contrast. The empath's consistency becomes more visible in hindsight. Their patience looks stronger. Their emotional courage looks rarer. Loss strips away distortion. When something is present, we normalize it. When it's gone, we analyze it. And analysis often leads to uncomfortable awareness. The avoidant may begin asking questions they once avoided. Why did closeness feel threatening? Why did I interpret love as pressure? Why did I withdraw when things became meaningful? These questions are not easy. They challenge identity. They challenge the narrative of independence as strength, but they are also the gateway to growth. Here's the philosophical truth. We don't grow when we feel right. We grow when we confront where we were wrong. The empath's absence forces reflection because there's no longer anyone to project onto, no one to blame for being too emotional or too intense. The silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable, but they're necessary. For some avoidants, this is the turning point. The loss becomes a catalyst. They begin exploring attachment patterns. They examine childhood conditioning. They recognize that distancing was protection, not preference. They start understanding that intimacy requires tolerating discomfort, not escaping it. For others, the growth is slower. Pride resists, ego resists, but even then, the seed of awareness has been planted. Because when someone truly loves you and walks away, it leaves an imprint. The empath didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because they chose self-respect, and that distinction matters. It reframes the story. It removes the illusion that the relationship failed because it lacked value. It failed because fear overrode courage. And once that realization surfaces, the avoidant can't fully return to unconsciousness. They may not immediately change, they may not reach out, but internally something has shifted. They understand, maybe for the first time, that pushing someone away doesn't eliminate vulnerability, it postpones it, and postponement always collects interest. Pain, when faced honestly, becomes instruction. Loss, when examined deeply, becomes awakening. And the empath's departure becomes more than a breakup. It becomes a mirror reflecting who they were and who they could become. Because sometimes the person you lost wasn't the lesson. The loss itself was. And what you do with that lesson determines whether regret becomes growth or just another pattern repeated. And now we arrive at the deepest layer of all. The one most avoidants don't consciously articulate, but feel in quiet moments. They don't just miss the empath. They miss who they were when they were with them. This is subtle. It's not about nostalgia for shared memories. It's not just about missing conversations or affection. It's about identity. Because relationships don't just connect two people, they activate two versions of self. With most people, the avoidant operates from protection, measured, guarded, self-contained. But with the empath, something different was possible. The empath's patience lowered defenses. Their emotional steadiness created room. Their acceptance reduced the need for performance. And in that space, the avoidant softened. Maybe not completely, maybe not consistently, but there were moments, real moments, where they were more open, more expressive, more emotionally available than they usually allow themselves to be. That version of them was not forced. It emerged. And here's the psychological truth. When someone consistently creates safety, your nervous system experiments with vulnerability. You risk a little more honesty, a little more transparency, a little more emotional exposure. The empath wasn't trying to change them. They were creating an environment where change felt safe. And once that environment disappears, something else disappears with it. The conditions that allowed that softer self to exist. In new relationships, the avoidant may revert. The walls go back up, the control returns, the detachment feels familiar again, it feels stable. But it also feels narrower because now there's contrast. They've experienced what it felt like to be understood beyond their defenses. They've experienced moments where they didn't have to constantly manage distance. And even if it scared them at the time, part of them knows it was real. This is the paradox. Avoidants fear losing autonomy, but what they often lose instead is emotional expansion. With the empath, they were expanding, even if slowly, learning to tolerate closeness, learning to sit in discomfort without immediately escaping, learning that vulnerability didn't automatically equal engulfment. That growth was uncomfortable, but it was growth. And after the breakup, when they reflect, what they miss isn't just the empath's warmth. It's the version of themselves that felt more human, more connected, less fragmented. Because beneath avoidance is longing, longing to be known without being controlled, longing to be close without losing self, longing to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. The empath didn't remove those fears entirely, but they made them negotiable. They made closeness feel survivable. And once you've tasted a more integrated version of yourself, it's hard to be fully satisfied returning to old defenses. This is where the regret becomes existential. It's not just, I lost someone good. It's, I stepped away from the version of me that was becoming better. That realization hits differently because now it's not about romance, it's about identity evolution. Relationships are mirrors. The empath reflected back a version of the avoidant that was capable of depth, empathy, reciprocity. And when that mirror is gone, the avoidant has to decide, do I retreat fully into old patterns, or do I continue growing without the person who made it feel safe? That's the real crossroads. And here's the philosophical core of all of this. We don't just grieve people, we grieve possibilities, we grieve unrealized potential, we grieve the future self that could have emerged if fear hadn't interrupted courage. The empath represented possibility, not perfection, not fantasy, possibility. And when an avoidant misses the empath, what they're often mourning is the life and the self that almost unfolded. So the question isn't whether they miss you. The deeper question is whether they are willing to become the person who could have kept you. Because in the end, love doesn't just reveal who someone is. It reveals who they are capable of becoming. So when we step back and look at the whole picture, the story becomes clear. Avoidants don't miss the empath in the way movies dramatize heartbreak. They miss in layers. They miss the regulation they didn't know they were receiving. They miss the safety their body quietly depended on. They miss being deeply seen. They miss the difference between validation and true intimacy. They miss the growth that loss forced them to confront. And ultimately, they miss the version of themselves that only emerged in the presence of someone who loved them with patience and depth. At first, walking away felt like power. Later, it feels like perspective. Because time removes ego from the equation. Time strips away pride and leaves only truth. And the truth is this: connection that challenges you to grow is rare. Someone who understands your silence without punishing it is rare. Someone who sees your defenses and responds with compassion instead of control is rare. The empath wasn't perfect, but they were safe, and safety is the foundation of transformation. When the avoidant rejected the empath, they thought they were choosing comfort. What they didn't realize was that they were rejecting expansion. They were choosing the familiarity of distance over the courage of depth. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Because whether you identify as avoidant, empath, or somewhere in between, the lesson is universal. We often push away the very thing that exposes our potential. Growth feels threatening before it feels empowering. Intimacy feels overwhelming before it feels grounding. Vulnerability feels dangerous before it feels freeing. The empath represents emotional courage. The avoidant represents emotional protection. And when those two forces collide, the outcome depends on one thing: who is willing to evolve. So if you're the empath listening to this, understand something powerful. Your value is not defined by who couldn't rise to meet you. Your depth is not diminished because someone feared it. Sometimes your role in someone's life is not to stay, it's to awaken. And if you're the avoidant listening to this, here's the deeper invitation. Missing someone is not weakness, it's information. Regret is not punishment, it's awareness. The question is not whether you lost someone meaningful. The question is whether you're ready to become someone capable of keeping meaning when it shows up again. Because love will test your patterns. It will expose your defenses. It will ask you to choose between control and connection. And in the end, the people we miss the most are often the ones who showed us who we could have been if we had the courage to stay open. So the real lesson of this entire journey is simple but profound. Don't wait for absence to teach you the value of presence. When depth shows up in your life, don't run from it. Rise to it.